Welcome to Moving Digital Health, a podcast series from MindSea. I'm your host, Reuben Hall, CEO of MindSea. Each week, we sit down with leaders and innovators in healthcare to hear their personal stories and explore how they're moving digital health forward. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Ajay Dhaul. Ajay is a world-class digital transformation leader who spent 25 years managing iconic consumer health brands including Tylenol, Neutrogena, and Johnson & Johnson. Now operating in the second chapter as an executive advisor and investor, Ajay bridges the gap between enterprise operations and AI fluency to help organizations shift from fragmented systems to continuous contextual care. Ajay, welcome to the show.
Reuben, it's really nice to see you.
You have a fascinating career trajectory. You manage some of those iconic brands we mentioned and on the commercial sales and marketing side before pivoting to lead global digital transformation and applied AI. Can you take us through that career journey?
Yeah, Reuben, I was very fortunate to work for two extraordinary companies. First was Dow Chemical, where I spent a decade. And then most recently, I spent 25 years at Johnson & Johnson in the consumer health division. And my career journey was, especially at J&J, this chance to work with very iconic brands, like you mentioned, of Johnson's Baby, Tylenol, Neutrogena. These are very beloved brands for, billion-plus consumers around the world. I was also very privileged to actually build a career trajectory that spanned multiple functions, marketing and sales, supply chain. I was able to work in different locations with the company. So I was in Switzerland, I was in Canada, Los Angeles, and obviously based in New Jersey, which is the company headquarters. And then to your point, I had a very interesting career pivot over the last 6 years where, despite being a business executive, I got to lead the data, AI, and digital transformation for the company globally. And as you can imagine, that was a steep learning curve, a pretty significant career pivot, but probably also one of the most enjoyable ones, especially given what's happening in the world in terms of the power of data and AI in turbocharging, whether it's consumer brands or healthcare in general.
And you've recently entered another chapter, moving from the corporate career to more of a dynamic portfolio career as an executive advisor, investor, and strategist. What's been the biggest shift in mindset moving from enterprise to advisory?
Yeah, great question. I would say it's still a work in progress. I, have been an operator for 35 years at these two, incredible companies of Dow Chemical and Johnson & Johnson. And, I've spent these last 3 decades being highly accountable to, outcomes and delivering on KPIs, and have been mostly the throat to choke, as we like to say, on delivering to expectations. In the second chapter, the transition, as you said, is I'm now really guiding and advising multiple companies, mostly at the intersection of, data, analytics, and AI. And obviously business enterprises that are talking about how do we really reimagine our business enterprises by leveraging some of this new emergent capability. So it's been a transition to go from being an operator to being more of an advisor and now a board member, where I'm providing a lot of oversight. But what's interesting is I suddenly feel like I've been able to widen my aperture across multiple companies, across different parts of the healthcare value chain. And what that's allowed me to do is to really amplify my impact way beyond what was previously this tremendous ecosystem of J&J, as an example. So very inspired about this shift, still work in progress in terms of, shifting from an operator to becoming more of an advisor and a guide and a board member, but very inspired by my ability to widen my impact.
And in those advisory roles, you're helping organizations move away from looking strictly through the lens of an insurance payer or hospital provider toward more of an end-to-end view of the healthcare ecosystem. In your opinion, what does true continuous contextual care look like to the patient?
Yeah, Ruben, great question. So, I have to say it's really been the last, I would say, 18 months where I've gone fairly deep in terms of the payer and provider side of healthcare. Um, and as we all know, this space is highly fragmented, highly siloed, and there's a lot of work that's taking place across, call it the healthcare value chain, to say how do you get that point of visibility in a seamless fashion to the patient. And so, to me, contextual care with the patient at the center is really making sure we stitch together, end-to-end visibility on, call it the patient and or data that obviously progresses, from the point of care through clinicians, obviously to the life science companies that are building the drugs for patient care, and then most importantly, the payers, to make sure that there is seamless integration in terms of the care that's being provided and all aspects of, call it, claims and reimbursements. I think there are companies right now that I've had visibility that are trying to tackle this, call it end-to-end value chain visibility all the way to the patient. It's work in progress. It's really hard work, especially given the data is segmented. There's lots of privacy issues with the data. There's issues in terms of sharing the data across these different industry segments. But, there's a tremendous opportunity. There is positive momentum. I think there are also some disruptors coming in this space. And so ultimately, I think the patient is going to win. We will see progressively better patient care. We will see the providers see less, call it, administrative load on them so that they can really, spend their energy in terms of real patient care. I think there's going to be a lot more streamlining and seamless integration of data between payers and providers. And then there's a whole world of AI that's also now being applied in terms of what could be taking place in terms of faster and more robust clinical trials and robust development for products. So I think that care continuum with the patient at the center is the ultimate vision.
And in that model, how do you see the patient ownership of their own data? Is that a realistic goal where they have the agency to be able to pick and choose, who gets that access?
Yeah, I think I think you've done well, Ruben. I think that is the end goal. I think there is progressively going to be, all of us, aka patients, getting greater visibility to, what we have. A great example of this is just the wearables right now that many of us as consumers and patients are, leveraging to see what's happening with the, call it, near real time, call it self condition, if you will. So I think that's where we're headed. I think there'll be greater control in terms of the patients having direct visibility of their own data, to your point. How that all actually then flows through the healthcare system in terms of how do we build more personalized treatment is still work in progress.
And how does applied AI serve as part of this shift? Is AI's greatest value right now in analyzing massive back-end data sets, or is it more in the real-time consumer-facing personalization for patient engagement?
Yeah, Ruben, I would say it's all of the above. So to our earlier discussion, right, there's heavy fragmentation across, call it, payers, providers, drug manufacturers, all the way to the patient. Now, what we're seeing is AI being leveraged first and foremost with the clinicians in terms of really addressing their administrative workload. So how do we shift and leverage AI technology so that there's better patient care that's taking place by the clinicians? There's lots of great work and emerging technology that's being applied in that space. Separately, there's also work that's taking place with the payers and the providers, and that call it interchange. And what you have there is a lot of legacy systems. And so a lot of the work there right now is first and foremost very data related. So how do you get clean, complete, connected data? How do you kind of migrate this data to more, call it modernized data stacks and the tech stacks, if you will? And then there's the application, around intelligent automation so that you start reducing some of the human workload. Again, back to all of the administrative stuff that's taking place because there's, incomplete and inaccurate data, if you will. And then there's AI being applied, obviously, to start becoming more predictive in terms of the patient journeys. There's work, like I said previously, also happening in life science companies to say, how do you really begin to expedite clinical trials? How do you begin to look at drug discovery? And what I would say is we clearly have pockets of excellence. The AI journey is still relatively new. It's beginning to pick up, positive momentum. My personal views, it's going to be the next 5 to 10 years where a lot of this will begin to happen at scale. And patients like you and I and others listening to this podcast become real beneficiaries of what hopefully becomes a much more end-to-end connected value chain that's addressing our needs.
There really are so many different applications and so many different ways to leverage AI. It's AI itself it's not a very descriptor of all a very good description of all of the different ways it can be applied. One of the ways is I at MindSea, running a software development company. The AI tools to write code and build software are just getting better and better and better. Have you seen an acceleration of, building digital health solutions going to market with the use of these tools like Claude Code, for example?
Yeah, I would say absolutely yes. I kind of think of, there was ChatGPT broke, I think it's November of 2022. And it's not like we did not have machine learning and data science and work that was happening with health tech prior. But I think the advent of ChatGPT and generative AI was a big spike in terms of this acceleration of this emerging technology of AI. There are lots of examples right now where, whether it's on the provider side with ambient listening, whether it's on the payer side in terms of how do I start looking across that value chain on predictive claims, resolution of call it patient claims, obviously a whole host of work that's taking place in terms of how do I personalize medicine, how do I, get much more robust clinical trials and get them done more expeditiously. So the short answer is yes, there's a lot of work that's taking place. The underlying base of a lot of this AI is data dependent. And that continues to be a real constraint. And there is no quick fix on what I like to say is clean, complete, connected data. That is just sheer hard work, right? That's legacy systems, highly fragmented, frankly, have been kind of, below the curtain. Most of the business executives who also have the purse strings haven't really been schooled enough to know the criticality of, call it clean and accurate data. And so I think part of the AI journey in the whole healthcare value chain is going to be how quickly we can start getting what I'm going to say is connected and accurate data. That's going to give us visibility all the way down through this value chain to the patient. And that's hard work that's going to take time. And so I think it's going to be a journey, and it's going to be a journey that's going to take place over the next decade, albeit with very bespoke solutions that are being built and being scaled by some of the early adopters.
Mm-hmm. Very strong point. If you don't, it's kind of the garbage in, garbage out metaphor, right? If you don't have good, clean data, really the AI is not going to be able to help you.
Indeed, indeed.
A typical scenario we see is that an organization gets excited about a new AI capability, they run a pilot, and then it gets stuck in this endless proof of concept limbo. And based on your experience scaling initiatives across large organizations, what are the reasons that those pilots fail or get stuck, and how do you get unstuck?
Yeah, Ruben. So I think most of the world right now is, including me when I was kind of leading this journey at J&J, went in through the emergent technology, getting proof points, frankly learning while doing some of these proof of concepts for real business impact. So kind of my learning, and I think it's a learning that's now widely held across the healthcare industry, is first and foremost, there's a recognition that there is limited fluency on this new technology of AI. And so how do we create fluency up and down the chain, but most importantly with, call it the C-suites, the boards, and the executive leadership that ultimately becomes a sponsor of these, AI solutions that are chasing after real business problem resolution. So I think there's an element of, call it fluency, that, is an investment. There's also been, in our excitement and euphoria of ChatGPT and the possibilities of generative AI, while we fostered experimentation, which is the right thing to do, a lot of companies are now taking a step back to say, how does this work really align with our strategic objectives? And making sure that these proof of concepts, these problem statements, have real, call it project chartering, and have visibility at whatever portfolio level to make sure that there's a level of accountability in terms of seeing this entire, proof of concept or the resolution of the problem end to end. The third piece is there's a lot of human friction on adoption, and that is again back to, I think, combination of the fear of this technology. It doesn't help that you and I wake up every morning to saying X percentage of headcount has been eliminated because of AI, and frankly, that's crippled a lot of employees and has really set this very, call it negative tone in terms of is this thing coming after my job, versus shifting that energy to, boy, this could really augment what I do and free me up from a lot of administrative stuff that I've been doing and allow me to kind of do more cognitive, work. So we've got tangled up in that for a bit. And then last but not least, sponsorship is really key, right? It's early emergent technology. It needs to be pointed at real business problems. And so these proof of concepts really need the, what I say, the tender loving care from the executive on down to make sure that they go through the journey. The organization learns, but there's great accountability at the end in terms of adoption, impact, and obviously traceability to, either a growth or some level of profit and loss statement.
The human aspect and the friction you mentioned, I think that can't be underestimated, because You can roll out the greatest tools and solutions, but if the clinicians or the administrators or whoever is using that tool is not on board, then you're going to have a terrible time of it. And certainly there's a spectrum that I've experienced of, people that are excited about the new thing or the new tool and are eager to adapt and to learn and to take advantage of it. And there's the other end of the spectrum, which is that this is actually a net negative to my output. It makes my job worse, and I could do this better though and faster the old way, without this solution. And then, of course, everyone in between.
Yeah.
And getting everyone on board with that solution is no easy feat.
Yeah, I agree, Reuben. You said it. It's a massive shift, and the technologists and the tech founders are super psyched about this. You brought up Claude. They are super excited. They are energized by the promise of this technology. But the rest of the world, which is the bulk of, non-technologists, they are still going about doing their job, trying to get fluent with this technology. And so I think there is an interesting collision that's taking place. And my personal view is, like the advent of any new technology, it's got to marinate. People have to, become schooled in it. Companies need to invest in that upskilling. And progressively, we will see that this also, like the internet and like previous launches of, significant technology, this too will take hold and ultimately become hell of a augmentation of the way work gets done, and really augment, what we are doing as humans. But I think we're in the teething pains of this whole launch, if you will. And I think progressively we'll see over the next 3, 5, 10 years that this will become very, very weaved into how you and I and the rest of us really leverage this technology and how it's impacting us. I think the promise of the technology is significant. I think in this conversation on healthcare, it's even more profound. And so I think it behooves all of us to say, how do we step through this in a very responsible way, take everybody along for the journey, and obviously invest in demystifying what this technology is.
Yeah, similar to how you were saying, good clean data is a requirement for AI to work properly, and also connected data. It's the implementation of solutions is going to be huge over the next decade. Though those people who can help manage that process of not only connecting the old technology with the new technology so everything can talk to each other, but understanding the clinical workflows and ensuring that the software and the AI works around that and folds into that cleanly, as opposed to trying to redefine a clinical workflow.
Yeah, very salient point made by you, Reuben, because, slapping this incredible technology onto a bad process and bad data is just royal waste of money. So I think, again, in our euphoria of this new technology, some of that has been done. I've made the same mistakes, in the early part of this, call it AI transformation. I think what's essential, like you said, as a critical ingredient, is how do you look at the current process and then reimagine it first and foremost. So really looking at how could this, whether it's a clinical process or other processes in the whole healthcare value chain, the tip of the spear needs to be the business process, how it gets reimagined. The next piece is how does data really flow end to end, and then ultimately is, how do you apply different aspects of AI and have the human and machines, call it collaborate, to ultimately deliver an outcome. And what I've seen is there'll be aspects of applying generative AI, there'll be aspects of agentifying some of this process, there'll be aspects of some classical data science that becomes a better predictor of an insight. All of that needs to be stitched together against a new reimagined process to, ultimately give a better, more efficient, more enhanced outcome.
Mm-hmm. And are you able to share like a specific example from your experience where you've seen all that come together and like a success story, if you will?
Yeah, happy to. I've got a number in my mind, but there's one I think that's probably more relatable to what you and I and everyday consumers and shoppers go through. And this was all about how do we make sure that for these iconic brands at J&J that we discussed, that we have very high availability of our products on shelf, whether it be the physical shelf when you go into a Shoppers Drug Mart, or maybe I go into a Walmart here in the US, and really to start predicting that we have the highest levels of on-shelf availability at that point of purchase when a consumer or a shopper like you and I walk in into the store, or also the digital store. So if you're on Amazon.com or one of the direct-to-consumer websites of these retailers or our brand sites. And so a lot of this work was actually leveraging all aspects of, building clean data sets, making sure that the data sets were integrated into, what I would call a 360 data product, something that became the universal source of truth in terms of all the inputs that were coming in. It needed data sets to actually collaborate between, in this case, the ultimate drugstore and the retailers and J&J as a manufacturer of these products. It needed, classical data science in terms of being able to build these predictive algorithms. We had brokers that were going into these retail stores as a final, call it, checkpoint to see, what was really taking place with product being on the shelf versus being hung up in the back room of these retailer outlets. How we took some of their input and leveraged generative AI aspects to take some of the, both text as well as, call it, graphics data. So, not to belabor this, but that whole chain of process, data, collaboration across, different aspects of the value chain, classical data science around prediction, generative AI, and eventually the process, continues to now get agentified so that you get more touchless in terms of being able to predict, and then obviously making sure that there's great execution. So when you and I are in the store, either physically or in the digital store, at that point of purchase, we always have our products, fully stocked. So, one of these projects that has taken a couple of years to kind of first do it in the US, Canada, scale globally, with great value proposition and frankly, tremendous, call it, customer and consumer delight at the end of, the chain.
Mm-hmm. I've heard some people ask, like, other industries have had the their data in a clean, secure, and interoperable place for years, right? Like take financial, for example. Like everyone, has their app where they can see their online bank and financial transactions. And they ask, well, why can't health be the same? Why can't I see my, health data that easily? Why isn't it, cleanly and securely available to me at all times? And I think at the end of the day, healthcare is a little bit messy, right? Like, there's there's issues with the, clean data because people are involved and people are kind of messy. So there's just a whole nother level of complexity to deal with there. And the amount and type of data that you get is so much more complex than some other industries or fields that have already had this figured out years ago, right?
Yeah, Reuben, I think you've said it really well. It's super messy, right? You have millions of provider points of care built on legacy systems. You've got multiple payer companies. You've got a whole plethora of, call it, life science companies that are developing the next set of drugs. Um, and so far, right, broadly speaking, the incentives have been misaligned. And I think that's part of the complexity of healthcare right now, is to say, listen, if I were to really win with the patient and really stitch things together with the patient at the center and provide personalized, call it, care and personalized medicine, how do I do it? And I think it's that messy web that we need to traverse. And obviously do it with, great respect for the privacy of the patient data. Also begin to open up what needs to happen across this value chain between payers, providers, and, call it, drug manufacturers. So to my earlier point, it's beginning to happen. It's beginning to happen in pockets, but there's a ways ahead, and it's a substantial investment that needs to come behind it. And that investment is, a bit foundational. And I think that's some of the hesitation that takes place in some of these legacy enterprises is, in a way, you're trying to untangle this, make it less messy. That requires an investment today, and the return could be a couple of years out. That's a tricky piece that enterprises are balancing in terms of, they recognize they need to make the investment. They recognize there's a delay in terms of outcomes and real, call it, positive impact. And I think that's a journey that we're all trying to reconcile and go through.
100% agree. To our audience of digital health builders and founders out there who are in the system, they have a brilliant vision and are navigating the realities of getting funding, winning their first client, or onboarding patients. If you were sitting with them as an advisor, what's the number one skill or advice you would give them to help them through that process?
Yeah, great question. So, Reuben, what I would say is I actually have had this privilege of being exposed to a number of founders in the last, 18 months or so as part of my second chapter, because I've had the time to really dig in and get visibility to what's taking place. I'm also advising a number of founders through things like the New Jersey AI Hub and Princeton University collaboration, amongst other forums that I'm leveraging. The very first piece of thing I would say is I am in such awe of the founders in terms of their fearlessness and their can-do attitude. So I would just say a tip of the hat to these founders. My advice is be humble. As great as your product is, be intellectually adaptable, because applying these products in, call it, these broader enterprises, which many of the founders generally don't have, experience with, there just needs to be a recognition that there is a level of navigation that takes place in these big legacy enterprise, non-digitally native companies that the founders need to navigate. And obviously then surround yourself with people who can bring great expertise, guidance, experience in how do you find the paths of least resistance in these enterprises to ultimately go solve problems. So I think my piece of advice is humility, listen, and be intellectually very adaptable with your product. And I am very, very optimistic you'll be successful.
Great advice. You've seen innovation both within large enterprises, homegrown within their enterprise, or the startup side of innovation coming out and then enterprises adopting that innovation. What do you see the benefits or trade-offs of both of those?
Yeah. So, the good news is that both of them need to coexist. So I think there's a recognition on a number of companies and, call it the large enterprises, to say that it would be foolish not to pay attention to what's happening in terms of external innovation, and being humble enough to say that, listen, while we may have significant investments and have had, decades of R&D, that there is some great work that's happening at a much greater velocity in some of these companies externally, call it some of the startup founding companies. I think the difference is that, inherently when you do development in large enterprises, you navigate a much more bureaucratic, process-driven, approval-driven, more risk-averse, call it, enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the nature of the beast. When you're, a small startup of, on a founder-led company, the risks of failure and the downside are, they're significant, but the risk of it, if it went wrong, it's not like you're impacting a multi-billion-dollar, call it P&L, if that makes sense. So, my personal view is that, and it's happening today with many enterprise companies, is they've invested in, call it their venture studios, to say, how do we look at innovation both within the four walls of a company, as well as invite external innovation. And I personally feel that combination is what's going to keep all of us in healthcare and across, frankly, other industries to kind of keep innovating faster than, any other part of the world.
You often advise looking at two vectors to find immediate value: follow the money and delight the customer. So in a complex space like digital health, where the person is using the tool, like a clinician, isn't always the one paying for it, hospital, insurer, payer, how do you balance those two vectors to thread the needle for traction?
Yeah, really good question, because there's a real inherent tension in this. My personal view is, if you anchor on delighting the patient or the customer, as you said, that needs to be the tip of the spear, and that's where the energy needs to go first. And to me, that is the greatest leveler, if you will, across any value chain, because then it can be monetized, and it can be monetized, over the long run. So, I would tip the balance to delight the patient, delight the customer, start there, make that the foundation in solving real problems that, the patient or the customer has. Now, the follow the money piece that's where discipline comes in on execution. And I think that's where, an experienced hand is one I would surround, myself with, to say, how do we make sure that the investments that are being made on delighting the customer also then are being done with, call it great diligence and discipline, so that, we're getting the biggest bang for a buck. And it's being done most efficiently. So I think that's the balance. But Reuben, to your question, I would tip the balance on delighting the patient or the customer.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for all your insights and the conversation today, AJ, and joining me on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you, Reuben. I really enjoyed this. I hope this is of great value to you and all of your listeners. And look forward to doing more of these with you in the future as I continue my second chapter.
And thanks to everyone for listening to the Moving Digital Health podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please go to movingdigitalhealth.com to subscribe to the MindSea newsletter and be notified about future episodes.